The purpose of a book's opening seems to me to carry a distinct challenge. And that challenge is, first of all, to take the reader out of the sensory apparatus that they're sitting in. And that is the space of the distracting world of technology and entertainment, and into that of the book. And that challenge is one that we can take for granted as simple because every book must do it. But of course, it's extraordinary that any book can accomplish that at all. That we can open a book and start reading and feel so fully engulfed by those words. And that is enough to carry us through hundreds, if not over 1,000 pages. And on top of that sensory experience that needs to be created by the words, the author is also having us become familiar with their voice, and not just familiar, but comfortable with that voice. And that comfort needs to be tight enough that we're going to want to spend our time with that narrative style for hours and hours and hours on end. And we're going to be willing to choose that narrative style over all of the other far more immediately gratifying, entertaining, distracting sources that surround us everywhere. We live in a time now where reading a book is harder than it possibly ever has been because there are so many other choices that are easier to take in. I made a video not too long back where I looked at some openings of big, massive books, and I gave my thoughts on what stood out to me about those books. I want to try that again this time. However, last time I picked majority books that I haven't read before with a couple outliers. This time I want to focus on books that I've either read before or at least attempted. And the reason I want to focus on ones that I have some familiarity with is because I want to look at how well that beginning actually matches what ends up being the specific focus of the rest of the book. And so you're going to be getting a taste of these big books. They're all like 1,000 pages, because I do think the aim of a large work, of like even a maximalist work of literature, is even harder to encapsulate in that opening page. And so I'm especially curious of how well the authors manage to pull that off. All of the books that I chose for this particular video do have some similarity, at least thematically. I think they all deal with breaking boundaries in some way. And that term boundaries is open-ended enough that you'll find that it's going to mean a whole bunch of different kinds of boundaries. To start, we have the boundaries between minds in the first book that we're going to look at. And then the second, we're going to look at the boundaries within memory of spaces. The ways that when we move from one place to another, we still carry a certain amount of that last place with us. And then I have two books by one author that are going to be looking at physical boundaries, literally the border, the southern border of the United States, and the constraints of legal boundaries on individual lives. And then we have the boundaries of time that separates us from minds far into the future, and the ways that our decisions right now are going to directly impact so many in the future. And what does that mean about how we prioritize what it is that we're choosing to do in terms of policy, but also what options do we even have left at this point, and how much of the decisions that we've made are permanent, whether we like it or not. So there's a few different books that I want to sort of struggle with, looking at how they start, and then making a judgment about how well that beginning captures what the rest of the book actually accomplishes. This will be the continuation of what I had done in my first video, looking at the openings of large books and making a judgment based on what can be found there. And what these books end up having in common with their boundary breaking is really a radical reconfiguration of how information presents itself on the page and in the mind. How every author is forced to make decisions about what information to present, and some authors pursue the vision of imposing an overabundance of information on us, and then putting the onus of putting boundaries on that information onto the reader. So the first book that we're going to look at is the latter sort, the sort of book that inundates with information to the point of being almost completely overwhelming. And that is Women and Men by Joseph McElroy. And you can see it's a huge book. It's about 1,300 pages or so. And this book is the only one on this list today that I did not finish. However, I did attempt it, and I had the feeling when I read it that I was not ready for what Joseph McElroy was trying to do. He treats conscious awareness not as part of individual minds, but distributed across networks. It creates this immensely strange prose style where we are zooming in and out of minds and spaces, and it feels like we're almost floating through the world in his literature. And it can make his writing fairly confusing, but also remarkable in its difference from other similar writing styles. There's plenty of writers who try to do that stream of consciousness floating style, but he really fully commits to this idea that he can just distribute out minds into the sky, into the ground, and throughout the buildings and across various characters, and you just have to follow it wherever it goes. And if you commit yourself to that following, it feels unlike any other thing that I've read. That also is the very thing that makes it really difficult to follow. And when you don't know what matters, you really don't know what's going on. And the book is giving you that feeling of helplessness that can emerge when you cannot see the pattern clearly that's in front of you, when the pattern is obscured. And that obscurity didn't feel to me like difficulty for difficulty's sake. It actually did match a lot of the feeling of what the book was trying to convey, since you are filling in the various gaps of detail, of sensory detail, and the words are really just popping the associations that you already have, and then you're filling those in. That then means that you have this virtualized experience of whatever's being described. And if the author takes advantage of the fact of you filling in that virtualization gap, then you have the opportunity of having a very different inner mind experience in the reading. And what is fascinating to me about what Joseph McElroy does is I feel like he's really trying to do that in his writing. Like, his books are really difficult, but there's also nothing else quite like reading them because of his commitment to that full stream of conscious style, where it's not just streaming in and out of spaces in clear delineated ways, but fully integrating that range of networks in the writing. It takes place in New York City in the 1970s in an apartment complex. And we have two main characters, a woman and a man, who never meet but are intricately connected via this apartment complex. And it's that tension of their almost nearness to one another that kind of carries a lot of the potential drama of the story. But really, it's just about a time and place and space, especially. And so that use of writing that is always flowing in and out, almost angelically, like above and down and through this space, captures that feeling of closeness between every mind within that apartment complex. It's such a strange book, it's very hard to summarize. When I first attempted this book, it felt to me very obvious that the length of it was actually going to be a huge hindrance to my capacity to finish it, because I was spending so much time on every page trying to make sure that I was following things just right. And I had this very strong sense that I was not ready for this book. And I eventually just put it down and knew that I would come back. And partially I want to read the opening of this book again today, out of a little bit of a selfish curiosity if I'm ready to read this now. So why don't we look at the opening of this together and try to make some sense of this strange book, Women and Men. It opens with a painful and stark act of creation in the chapter Division of Labor Unknown. After all, she was not so sure what had happened or when it had started, which was probably not a correct state to be in, because what had happened made the biggest difference in her life so far. Hours of life that worked her back full to breaking of pain and drained it of its work when the back of her child's head, with a slick of dark hair and its rounded shoulders, gave her that last extra push to free its arms still held inside her. She would tell her husband later. She knew she would, and she did tell him. She told her husband, and he told others for weeks afterward. Also, he had his own side to tell. She loved his excitement. Pain all in her back worked free of her at the end, dropping away into a void below, and it could almost not be recalled. This pain had been new and undreamt of, as new as the height of the young obstetrician whom she had never seen until she arrived at the hospital. He stood in surgical green against the ceiling above her head, then at her feet, at a distance down there between the stirrups, tilting his head this way and that way between her thighs, and the green cap on his head was as far away as the bright, fairly unmetallic room she was giving birth to her child in. And the young obstetrician's words were the talk that went almost and sharply along with the pain her husband Shay, she was thinking of him as Shay, also in surgical green, could not draw off into the $10 pocket watch he timed her with. Where was it? In a pocket? Mislaid? She didn't care where it was. Her husband Shay's chin hung close to her. I will always be here, his chin might have said, and his hand out of sight somewhere gripped hers. His hand might have been invisible for all she knew. But then he had to see for himself what was going on at the other end, and he moved down to the foot of the delivery table, and he peered over the doctor's shoulder as if they were both in it together. And then Shay half looked up from that end against his better judgment, she was sure, and frowned at her, but with love, smiled, the old smile. He needed a shave. His tan had grown seedy. The doctor stood up between her thighs and said they were getting there. So with this opening, we actually begin with a single perspective of subjectivity, that of the mom giving birth to her child. And we have this central feeling of her feeling like an object for the doctor and even partially for the husband, who himself becomes curious, and so through his curiosity he views her body from the underside. We are getting a taste of the subjectivity that pervades the whole of the rest of the novel, but we are given it through one single perspective. One clue of what will eventually emerge more often throughout the rest of the narrative is the level of uncertainty that this passage opens with. After all, she was not so sure what had happened or when it had happened, and so now we're given uncertainty as a fundamental narrative mode that we're beginning with. And we're given this idea that it does matter, this thing that she's not sure about, because it says what had happened made the biggest difference in her life so far. So there's this tension between the subjective perception and the objective experience that actually occurred. And it's reminding us of that distance between the subjective and objective, what we can know for certain and what actually is for certain. And that's a difference you can never quite escape. And it hints at this transformative moment of childbirth while simultaneously getting us to at least initially question the reliability of memory and interpretation, right? Because it opens with that line, she does not know when this happened. And then I really like the almost grammar in this sentence, this next sentence, where it's a mix of active with passive at once. And it's reinforcing that feeling of this character herself being an object in this space. It says, hours of life that worked her back full to breaking of pain and drained it of its work when the back of her child's head with a slick of dark hair and its rounded shoulders gave her that last extra push to free its arms still held inside her. And so we have two subjects that are acting upon this character's body. We have the hours of life that worked her back full to breaking. So the hours of life itself, time passing itself, is imposing on her. And then we have the child's head gave her that last extra push to free its arms. And so it's not even what is really happening, which is her pushing the baby out. In the way that this is described, the baby is pushing itself out. And so she is fully removed as a subject with agency in this moment. And further down, it hints at some of the recursive telling and retelling that's going to happen throughout the rest of the novel, because really this book is all about communication and people's interactions with each other and also distance amidst that interaction. It says, she would tell her husband later, she knew she would, and she did tell him. She told her husband, and he told others for weeks afterward. Also, he had his own side to tell. She loved his excitement. And so this telling and retelling of personal experience is taking something distinctively personal and making it collective. And in that process of translation from the personal to collective, you also have a translation into different perspectives, where his version is going to be entirely different than hers, even though she was the one actually giving birth. And it's like you're experience is robbed from you in the moment that it is told to someone else, because they are going to interpret or misinterpret in their own wide variety of ways. But it's not an entirely negative framing of that sort of telling and interpretation, because in describing how she's going to tell her husband this information, it also says she knew she would, which is implying the bond that they have together. Some of what makes relationships so extraordinary is the voluntary ways in which we give up a part of ourselves to be a part of that. We sort of allow people to interpret and define us outside of us. And there's a hint of that here with the fact of her willingly knowing that he's going to interpret his own way and things are going to shift. But that's just part of the deal of being with someone, is you're going to have difference be the markers that carve out the margins of who you are together. And the last part of this opening that I want to focus on is we have pain all in her back, work free of her at the end, dropping away into a void below, and it could almost not be recalled. This pain had been new and undreamt of. So we have McElroy, which this is something that he does a lot throughout this book. He's capturing the phenomenological nature of pain and memory through his writing. The ways that the experiencing of pain can be something immensely difficult to describe, and that is precisely the sorts of descriptions that he endlessly toys with throughout the writing in this book. The pain becomes almost abstract as a thing that exists and then also doesn't. It's something that both disappears and also comes out of her. Pain all in her back, work free of her. It's something that has a subjectivity all its own. What's interesting to me in reading this opening paragraph is actually how much easier it is to follow than what will occur further down the line in the novel. It's a much more inviting opening paragraph than what happens later. And I suspect that McElroy knew that so much of his writing style is quite convoluted and difficult to follow. And so he's opening with something fairly straightforward. We can all understand a pregnancy and giving birth. And this act of creation is going to be the key image that we hold on to as we follow this child. This feeling of looking down from afar and zooming in and out of the single subjectivity of the mom that is then being dispersed through language to everyone around her through Shay. That is just at least a hint of what's to come in the actual more complex layers that happen later on in the novel. Maybe I'll read a bonus passage later in the video. At the very end, I'll throw in a passage from later in the book so you can get a sense of how much more complicated it actually gets, while also staying quite beautiful. The reason I'm motivated to read McElroy so much is even though I find his writing really difficult to follow for long stretches, I do enjoy the commitment he has to this elongation of thought across his prose. It feels different than reading other books. I'll throw in a passage at the end of this video to show some of the later section of the book. But let's move on to the next one, which is similar in some of its interests of capturing a splitting of the mind, but instead of splitting across various different characters, it seems more split between experience in one's lifetime, between the experience of home in one space and then home in another, and what that means and how they intermingle and contrast between one another. That next book that I'm going to look at is a 2-volume collection called Anniversaries by Uwe Johnson. So I actually don't know how it's pronounced. It might be Uwe Johnson or U Johnson. Let me know in the comments. I'm sure some of you will. By the way, let me know your own interpretations of these openings when you look at it. What I liked about the last video is a lot of you told me some other details to notice, and I think that's really nice. I'm not going to cover every single paragraph line by line. So if there's things that you think are important in these opening paragraphs that you think might represent something thematically significant later on, let me know, and I'd love to hear about it. What's most immediately fascinating about the Anniversaries set of books is it was written by a German writer and written initially in German, but it is about New York City, and it actively engages with the history of America and other parts of the world. It's a German's view of American life in the 1960s. And it's a really zoomed in view of that life because unlike most books which parcel out the major events that matter, and those are the ones described in detail, this one follows a diaristic format of every day and having us follow this mother and her daughter as they live in New York City. And the mother is an emigre from Germany. What we get through this daily recounting of events is this strange dual timeline narrative of the character living out their life in 1960s New York and all of the tensions therein, such as around the Vietnam War and around the Civil Rights Movement. And then that is being paralleled by her memories of childhood in Nazi Germany and partially in East Germany. And it's this constant laying out of the daily minutia of living. And it really is like full-on minutia, day by day by day. And it's a really fascinating way of telling a story because it's actively not telling a story in the sense that typically what is required in a story is a certain amount of selectivity. And it's the lack of selectivity where it's taking in even the days where almost nothing happens and just allowing you to just live with this person for a while. And really, it's less about the events of that person's life as much as it is about having you live within the atmosphere of that life. And so the accomplishment of those daily entries is making you feel the continuous mundane of living and the challenges that persist and also the challenges of memory in the midst of being in a new space. And the novel itself was written by Johnson in German, and it wasn't translated until many years later. So this is like the most recent translation that we have. And I think it's the only translation that actually includes the entirety of the novel, which is fascinating in itself to have it be written by a German writer, but be so fascinated itself by American life and politics. Similarly to the Women and Men book by Joseph McElroy, it's shifting perspectives a lot, like literally shifting between first and second and third person perspective. And that also creates this strange overabundance of almost confusion between the voice that is being taken on at any one point in time. But the grounding is always the main character, that German emigre in New York and her experiences. And so that's the thing that's going to ground you as the subjectivity is shifting all over the place. Like it's a bit like the USA trilogy by Dos Passos, where we're getting the news feed of what's happening day to day to day to day, and then having that in tandem with someone's livelihood and their attempts to just make it in the space of constantly brewing, often racial tension. And what makes it most fascinating ultimately is that its ordinariness becomes really about following ordinary people in the midst of authority that superimposes onto them various restrictions. And so that's that element of boundary that is always there. And it's about what is it like to be in a time when we're becoming so obsessed with the boundaries that we can impose upon others and the ways that we can restrict. What does that feel like to be someone who doesn't have enough influence or authority to do much about it, but they can feel those boundaries imposing again and again and again. And it's that fascination with that psychology of what it's like to experience such a thing that is precisely what takes the otherwise mundane stacking of details and places them into a space of significance, because those ordinary lives remain the very lives that are most in tune with some of the pains that are happening around them. It's almost elevating those most ordinary moments of grocery shopping and subway commutes and bank transactions and trying to make them signals of what is happening in the broader atmosphere of a time and place. And that is like what stands out most about this book, is it really feels like you're entering into a separate time and space for a little while you follow this mother and daughter just trying to make it through it all. It opens, long waves beat diagonally against the beach. Bulge hunchbacked with cords of muscle raise quivering ridges that tip over at their very greenest. Crests stretch tight, already welted white, wrap round a cavity of air crushed by the clear mass like a secret made and then broken. The crashing swells knock children off their feet, spin them round, drag them flat across the pebbly ground, past the breakers, the waves pull the swimmer across their backs by her outstretched hands. The wind is fluttery. In low-pressure wind like this, the Baltic Sea used to peter out into a burble. The word for the short waves on the Baltic was scrabbly. The town is on a narrow spit of the Jersey shore, 2 hours south of New York by train. They fenced off the wide sandy beach and sell tickets to out-of-towners for $40 a season. Retirees in uniforms slump at the entrances and keep an eye out for the badges on the visitors' clothes that grant admission. The Atlantic is free for those who live in the beach houses, which sit sedately on the stone embankment above the hurricane line, with their verandas, 2-story galleries, colorful awnings under complicatedly slanting roofs. The dark-skinned help who live here fill their own church, but Negroes are not supposed to buy houses or rent apartments or lie on the coarse white sand. Jews, too, are not welcome here. She is not sure whether Jews were still allowed to rent houses in the fishing village near Jericho before 1933. She cannot remember any signs prohibiting it from the years that followed. Here, she has borrowed a bungalow on the bayside for 10 days from friends. The people in the house next door receive the mail and read the postcards that the child writes to Dear Miss C from summer camp, but they insist on calling her Mrs. Crespall and seem to want to see her too as a Catholic of Irish descent. Gazines Crespall, kick her heel and make her fall. We're immediately struck with a string of aggressive verbs and corporeal metaphors, with beat, bulge, raise to describe the waves, and hunchbacked and cords of muscle, all of which are anthropomorphizing the water itself of the ocean. And it creates a sense of deliberate and almost threatening force that's imposing its way in on those along the beach. And typically beaches you would associate with vacation and freedom and fun, but the sense of these words, the tone, is already quite imposing, and that imposition is something that reoccurs later on in the passage. And that kind of aggressiveness also matches somewhat the staccato nature of the line itself. When we look at the next one, it says, crest stretched tight, already welted white, wrapped round a cavity of air crushed. And so we have this tension of compressed phrases back to back before the simile of a secret made and then broken, which I guess lightly introduces the epistemological themes that are going to come up later about what are the secrets that are held and then let go across time. And when it describes the wind is fluttery, in low pressure wind like this, the Baltic Sea used to peter out into a burble, we're given between this semicolon hinge of the wind is fluttery and then the low pressure wind of the Baltic Sea, this present America versus the remembered Germany. That's what borders the Baltic Sea that's being described. So that semicolon is kind of separating the 2 points. And that shift between the two, between the present America and the past German atmosphere, is that introduction of the dual geography that's going to take place throughout the rest of the book, between her space in America and her memory of Germany. How both spaces are present past in the sense that they persist continuously within Crespall's conscious awareness. And it is as much a part of her present day as it was when she was there long ago. Everything is relational and in reference to her prior experiences with something similar in Germany. So even the very waves of this American shoreline are like the waves of the Baltic Sea, and there's a reminder of this past space that she once was a part of. The journalistic shift that happens further down is interesting, where it says the town is on a narrow spit of the Jersey shore, 2 hours south of New York by train. They've fenced off the wide sandy beach and sell tickets to out-of-towners for $40 a season. Retirees in uniforms slump at the entrances and keep an eye out for the badges on the visitors' clothes that grant admission. And we have here this term they, right, which seems to suggest like institutional power that's imposing these rules on this space. And we already have this parallel to Germany in the 1930s. And so maybe it's on this beach trying to illustrate to us, at least lightly, the ways that institutional rules end up creating boundaries within spaces. And so this wide sandy beach that is itself fenced off is a kind of isolating separation where we're cutting away within the space that people would otherwise enjoy publicly, and it's now becoming a private space. And then we also have the looking out for the badges, which I imagine is a kind of iconography that should be familiar to that German image of wearing a marker of your placement in society. And so we have these kind of hints of her seeing parallels in the current day version of what America has become and what she experienced back home in Germany. And it's not the same, but it's that poetic parallel of noticing the ways that images overlap metaphorically, similarly enough. And that is the parallel that at least has an emotional resonance, even if it is not literally the same. And then she reinforces that parallel even more when she brings up the architectural signifiers, the ways that those who live in the beach houses, those who are already well off, end up getting free access to this Atlantic stretch of ocean, something that they don't really need. It's almost like an excess of privilege being imposed upon those who are already privileged. We get some light anthropomorphizing of those beach houses too, with them sitting sedately as if calmly and like chill and just hanging out. And it's that relaxed, retired state of these houses, which kind of suggests like a privileged stability on their part. So these houses just sit sedately, everything's calm and cool, and there's no trouble within these spaces. And it's just giving us that feeling of this kind of relaxed privilege that they get to have. And through the accumulation of the details that follow of the verandas and two-story galleries and colorful awnings under complicatedly slanting roofs, we get like a visual catalog of the wealth of that particular space. And it's suggesting to us immediately a contrast between those who have to pay to access the beach and those who already have wealth that are given the benefit of not even having to pay at all. And pardon the airplane, airplanes keep flying overhead every time I want to record. And then we have this string of repeated correlative conjunctions to describe the things that a certain group of people cannot do, where it says they are not supposed to buy houses or rent apartments or lie on the coarse white sand. And so it's this tricolon use of or to stack together all of the restrictions being imposed on one group of people. And again, it's that in contrast to the beach houses, which get all the privileges available along this beachside home, and those who also live in this space who lack in these privileges. And then it's strange, the wording here where it says Jews too are not welcome here. It's almost flippant the way it kind of throws that in at the end, and it's almost using the Jewish exclusion as a rhetorical bridge to the German anti-Semitism that ends up following in the next paragraph. She's not sure whether Jews were still allowed to rent houses in the fishing village near Jericho before 1933. She cannot remember any signs prohibiting it from the years that follow. And so through that 1933 historical shorthand, we're expected to just infer the particular time period and the impositions that were being imposed. And that lack of confidence about the actual explicit signs is a reminder of how persecution doesn't always carry a sign. Sometimes there's just cultural mores that become normalized over how to treat groups of individuals. It's not always going to be stated literally on a sign. And already we have this sense that this novel is going to be consistently juxtaposing between the historical memory of racism and the current American racism of the 1960s. And that juxtaposition is going to maybe play with the differences and the similarities as it goes along. But it is an immediate fixation as soon as the novel begins. It's this traveling memory where the experiences from the main character's past are becoming new means of interpreting what is happening now. And with this final point, we have the main character's neighbors misidentifying her background with how they insist on calling her Mrs. Crespo, but want to see her as a Catholic of Irish descent. So it's like they want to impose a more acceptable identity onto her as opposed to the one that she actually has. And then we have this rhyme about her name, which is presumably from the children who know her. We're given in that last part of that passage the negotiation that the character has to play between her self-perception and the social categorization that people want to impose upon her. And that frustration of just trying to live and then having these continuous barriers against just living is precisely why the daily record of the novel is so poignant throughout, because you are going day by day by day by day by day with this character, and you're not being entertained with constant moments of significance, but rather the significance of smaller moments, having the wondering of what's to come next, or the ways that these social categories become so distracting and such an imposition on someone's life, how the mundane can suddenly become a part of the big history of one's time. And as we go day by day with this character, we do feel like we are with this character, like we're not looking away out of convenience. And the news that periodically interjects between her story becomes the news that interjects into her life. So that was Anniversaries by Uwe Johnson. Now we move on to The Borderline Between Nations, with William T. Vollmann's examination of the Imperial Valley in California with his work Imperial. It's hard to categorize precisely what Vollmann is doing in this work. It's not just investigative journalism, it's also just as much cultural history, a memoir. There's a bit of fiction in there as he speculates about various things that he can't find direct answers for. There's lots of direct experiences that he has trying to find out about the potential tunnels underneath the ground or the current conditions of the Salton Sea. And he asks question after question about what's going on in this space of constant border tension. And his questions don't end up finding an answer. And so the answerlessness of this book is what gives it a very strange character. It's not quite a history book, and it's not quite a work of journalism. It's not organized in the typical chronological fashion. What you end up getting instead is a series of impressions about what it's like to be in this space along the border and the long history of combativeness over scarce resources in that space, and also the manipulation of scarce resources, such as the distribution of water, not just in Imperial Valley, but throughout California. There's a lot packed into this one work. And yet, of course, Vollmann is fully aware the whole time of the interest in the geographical border that underlines so much of the tension that he ends up focusing in on. And so he views that one simple division along that border as a symbol of the complexity of the entire zone, the intermingling of economies and ecologies and social identities and capital and the fueling of business, and how much is at stake over ownership of land, and especially ownership of the resources in that land. It takes Imperial Valley and makes it about the conquering of space generally, and what it means to own land and to have a constant awareness of the borderline segmenting different peoples in one space. And since Vollmann knows that the borderline itself is the starting point of so much of what he ends up diving into, that is precisely where he chooses to begin this work. The Gardens of Paradise. I think we all feel sorry for him. Border Patrol Officer Gloria I. Chavez. Body snatchers. The All-American Canal was now dark black with phosphorescent streaks where the border's eyes stained it with yellow tears. These lights have been up for about 2 years, Officer Dan Murray said. Before that, it was generators. Before that, it was pitch black. He was an older man, getting big in the waist, whose face had been hardened by knowledge into something legendary. For years he'd played his part in the work first begun by Eden's angel with the flaming sword, the methodical patrols and prows to keep the have-not millions out of paradise, which in this case was Imperial County, California, whose fields of blondness, of endless pallid asparagus, onion plants like great lollipops, and honey-colored hay bales produced the lowest median tax income of any county in the state. Zone El Centro, named after the county seat, comprised sectors 210 to 226, of which sectors 217 to 223 happened to be Murray's responsibility. He kept the key to the armory, whose rows of M4 shotguns awaited a mass assault from Southside, which never came. He knew how to deploy the Stinger spikes, the rows of accordion-like grids like a row of caltrops. Pull a string and they opened up to puncture a tire. One car actually drove 12 desperate miles on 4 flat tires until it was wrecked beyond any conceivable utility to its confiscators. They'll pop their heads up in a minute, he was always saying. He was always right. So it should be obvious from the get-go the central tension that Vollmann is trying to make us consider. He starts with this epigraph, I think we all feel sorry for them. And that's from a Border Patrol officer. And so what we have here is empathy versus enforcement of the U.S.-Mexico border. And it's saying, I feel sorry for them while being the exact person still enforcing the rules that make them feel sorry for their situation. We immediately are thrust into the gap between personal feeling and institutional action. It reminds me a bit of, there's this independent game that came out a few years ago called Papers, Please, where the whole purpose of that game is you are a border patrol agent deciding who can enter into your country, and you're offered these stories from various refugees trying to find a way in, and you have to follow these strict rules about who can get in and who can't. And in that game, it's trying to cause you to feel the tension of knowing the quota of who can be allowed and the rules therein, but then also seeing the people directly yourself and hearing their stories and having that feeling of direct individual empathy and the recognition of the distance between what we can so obviously recognize when we look someone in the face and we speak to them directly, but what can be distanced by the layering of names on paper and numbers, and how that distance can make it so easy to forget the human on the other side. And so that opening epigraph is already capturing that tension. And then it begins with this titling of the section Body Snatchers, and that immediately invokes both horror film imagery and this idea of the bodies being commodities shipped and grabbed and taken. And it also foreshadows Vollmann's interest in examining how these bodies are valued, exploited, and discarded along these borderlands. And then we lead into a surreal lyrical description of the all-American canal was now dark black with phosphorescent streaks where the border's eyes stained it with yellow tears. And so we are rendering these factual geographies as mythic landscapes charged with emotion and symbolism, right? The border's eyes stained with yellow tears, and those yellow tears are the lights themselves kind of reflecting downward. And then we have these lights have been up for about 2 years, Officer Al Mori said. Before that, it was generators. Before that, it was pitch black. And we have this strange chronology of illumination of it starting out completely darkened and unseeable, and then it's becoming more and more illuminated via the increasing militarization and surveillance along this border. And so the dark to light is also indicative of the increased government enforcement within that space. It tracks the border's transition from a natural boundary to a boundary zone. I think the poetic description itself also captures the strangeness of the whole situation by making you see it anew. He's describing that borderline in such a way that you're seeing it as if for the first time, and the surreal quality of it is now rising to the top. And then we have this dual characterization of the person along the border, of him being aging and overweight, so these mundane, less appealing details, and then implying that via his knowledge he has shifted into something legendary, as Vollmann writes here. It kind of reflects Vollmann's approach to the entire Imperial region, where he's simultaneously focusing in on the ordinary aspects of it, but then also trying to lift the history up into something that feels almost epic in its proceeding and grander than any one individual living within that space. And then it continues with what I consider to be a crucial, lengthy sentence. For years he'd played his part in the work first begun by Eden's angel with the flaming sword, the methodical patrols and prows to keep the have-not millions out of paradise, which in this case was Imperial County, California, whose fields of blondness, of endless pallid asparagus, onion plants like great lollipops, and honey-colored hay bales produce the lowest median tax income of any county in the state. I love this sentence because it's like multiple key themes are stacking up together right in that one space. We have the biblical imagery of the flaming sword and this notion of paradise, which the flaming sword is something that is brought up in Genesis. It was given to the cherubim to guard the Garden of Eden after Adam and Eve were banished from it. That biblical sense in this space is also that sense of grandness that he's trying to instill into our association of what's going on along this border space. It's guarding the Garden of Eden, the space that people wish to go where abundance is full. It's ironically implying a kind of sanctity to the space when, of course, all of this is institutional. It's not God-given. We have the economic ironies of the region, right? The agricultural abundance that's there, but it's also there alongside directly the poverty that persists throughout that space. And then we have the sharp contrast between the mythic conception of Imperial County, of paradise, and then the actual reality of it being the lowest median tax income bracket in California. And so it's like he's toying with the contrast in the imagery between the fruits of this space being so full and yet the output for those actually there being so low. And then that final line, of course, they'll pop their heads up in a minute, he was always saying, and he was always right. And with that final image, a repetitive image, it's suggesting the almost ritualistic, cyclical nature of Border Patrol, of just heads popping up, alarm, panic, running, heads popping up, alarm, panic, running. It's taking something which in isolation would be so horrible, and then it's normalized through repetition. And the Border Patrol agent knows it's going to come, and it's just kind of another day on the job, just another thing. And that feeling of taking something which would seem so strange in a different context, via its repetition, it becomes just everyday, just normal. From this description of Volman, we get the border as both a physical and mythical space with these ties to kind of biblical allusions. And we get glimpses into the human consequences of immigration policy, the contradictions and the tensions that occur right there along that borderline between the personal empathy or personal awareness of the individuals on the other side, but also the institutional requirements of enforcing that space. And that is a lot of what Volman ends up most curious about as Imperial goes along. And I should mention that it's one of those books that I wish was more focused on the border than it actually ends up being. Volman uses the border as a jumping off point to really talk about the history of resource scarcity and fighting over that scarcity and manipulation of the rules within that space in order to take advantage and pull resources from one space and distribute them to another as a kind of accumulation of wealth. It really ends up being about manipulation of capital within the American system. That is interesting in and of itself, but of course that starting point of starting with the border, that human side of it, is really the most fascinating side, and I wish he had stayed there a little bit longer than he actually does. He ends up just bringing it up and then going back into the economic history and talking about a lot of the excessive amounts of details there. And he has all of these strange interests and other elements of what's happening in the Imperial Valley. It has the quality that Volman's works almost always have, which is a willingness to just follow his passions wherever they lead. And he sometimes seemingly forgets the reader's expectations and interests. You know, he sets this expectation at the beginning of the border being the main focus, and it ends up becoming really marginal in the degree of attention devoted to it, which I guess is fitting considering it is the borderline. But I want to bring up another work of Volman that I think also has an intriguing opening. And this one he fulfills more directly throughout the rest of the work. And that is Volman's Carbon Ideologies, which is his look at climate change specifically from an ideological frame, because he tries to see how we've become attached to a kind of lifestyle that itself is upending the lifestyle of future generations. Him looking at it through this ideological lens makes it so that he questions our capacity to be able to change no matter how bad the problem gets. We've become so spoiled by a certain way of living and seeing the world. And he doesn't judge that from afar, from like this distant kind of, oh, look at you foolish people with your lifestyles. He looks at it fully sympathetically as, well, I'm just as spoiled as you are, and I have the same expectations as you do. And in fact, most people throughout the world have these expectations of ease born of technology. And for us to assume that we can just take that away in order to solve this problem is maybe taking for granted a little bit more long-term thinking from human beings than they actually have. And he starts from a skeptical frame because Vollmann himself was someone initially skeptical of climate change. And then through looking deeper and more carefully on the subject, he becomes quite committed to it as a serious problem. But then the agony that he goes through in the process of studying the subject is really that it doesn't seem like a problem that can actually realistically be solved due to the kind of human psychology that brought us into this problem in the first place. So the framing that he has for the opening of this book is that he's writing this book to future generations, the ones who are dealing with the consequences of our decision in regards to climate. And so he apologizes to that future generation while also offering an explanation for why we didn't solve the problem, even though we were fully aware of it as a problem. And so that's this interesting addressing to the future readers of a hot, dark world. And that's the broad framing that he offers at the beginning of this book. And so let's actually look at how he sort of introduces this subject and brings us in to both his skepticism and this meta frame of writing the book as a letter to the future, essentially apologizing for what we've done. The chapter is called, What Was the Work For? We are the soul, of which railroads, copper mines, steel mills, and oil wells are the body, and they are living entities that beat day and night, like our hearts, in the sacred function of supporting human life. And that's a quote from Ayn Rand in Atlas Shrugged, 1957. An internal combustion engine is a machine for converting chemical energy to mechanical energy by burning a fuel with air in a confined space and expanding the products of combustion, extracting energy as work. This definition, which combines straightforwardness and completeness into a kind of elegance, comes courtesy of a World War II primer for U.S. Navy midshipmen. The world in which I lived had long since been remade by just such machines, and by their cousins, which converted nuclear and calorific energy to electrical energy, likewise doing work. But what was the work for? When my generation was alive, I used to wake up, reach out, and turn a switch to light up my bedside. To you who can no longer live this way, this must sound as incredible as if I were to claim that I called on angels or that I could wander anywhere without a radiation meter. And I do admit that every now and then the bulb would burn out, while on rarer occasions the power would even fail, at which my essentially windowless dwelling grew rapidly unpleasant, too dark to read in, humid in summer, clammy in winter. But such perturbations remained so unlikely that each morning I flicked that switch with confidence. Somewhere, unknown mechanisms would do work on my behalf. My dressing table now being illuminated, I picked up the plastic pocket clock whose two slender silver batteries converted chemical energy into electricity for a year or more at a time, after which I removed them, threw them away, and inserted new ones. That was how I knew the time. If it was already rising hour, I strolled to the bathroom and showered to my heart's content. In those days, I saw nothing wrong in letting a stream of hot water tingle the back of my neck, even when I was clean. It did wonders for grogginess. One of my women friends loved to shower just to think. If you from the future are the losers for this, I am sorry. I think we felt a kind of grandness to have so many energies at our call, even if we rarely thought about our situation. Why shouldn't they serve us faithfully? The sweet, open friendliness of a young child, which can charm a smile out of an impatiently busy adult, derives from no sublimer cause than inexperience. The child has not yet learned that the world will refuse and reject him, then plow him under. And when my generation flourished, why should we have imagined that electrical power would ever decline to fulfill our whims? That is why we were happier than you. I certainly enjoyed showering to warm up, showering to cool down, showering before and maybe again after making love, washing my hair whenever it felt greasy. My water heater, by the way, was electric powered because the contractor who installed it had explained that electricity would cost me less than gas. He was another one whose magic powers brought him joy. I used to like his smile when he fired off that hissing battery-powered gun of his. Great nails flew out, slamming themselves deep into boards, panels, and beams, instantly in place as if they had been there forever, except that the nail heads were warm. There went his arc welder, strengthening my window bars and improving the evening with fireworks of sparks. He was a man of almost incredible endurance and physical strength who helped me over and over. Sometimes he burned or gashed himself on my behalf. I loved to watch him fix things. Footnote. Like my realtor friend, he described global warming with the word evolutionary. He said that the poles of the earth had rotated several times, and this might now be occurring. He said that even Al Gore had stopped referring to global warming and now spoke of climate change. That the climate was changing he was inclined to acknowledge, but he suspected that humans were only a small part of the cause. How this would ameliorate our situation if it were true, I could not tell at first, but then he went on to mention epidemics and the great meteor which might have exterminated the dinosaurs, and remarked that some such disaster might befall us at any time, so that I began to comprehend his reaction as a kind of fatalism near to mine. I had begun to suspect that global warming was inevitable, so what should I be but fatalistic? End of footnote. Had someone inquired as to whether a gas or electric heater was better for the planet, neither he nor I would have known the answer. Here it is. Using electricity to generate heat is extremely inefficient, said a solar energy handbook. In any case, the shower proved nearly as reliable as a bedside lamp. I let the water run and run until its temperature suited me. Then I stepped beneath that comforting flow. It is true that when someone else took a shower right before me, the hot water ran short, but that was on account of my economically small heater, 58 gallons, not because of any lack of electricity in the world. You can immediately see from how this is written Vollmann's interest in taking the granular personal experience of individual lives and the expectations of convenience that electricity brings, and then him stretching that out into some grand message to the future about why it was that we had the expectations that we did, and why it was so hard for us to change. He opens with his epigraph from Ayn Rand, which kind of establishes the book's central metaphor of technological systems as living organic entities when he writes, "We are the coal, of which railroads, copper miners, steel mills, and all wells are the body, and they are living entities that beat day and night, like our hearts, in the sacred function of supporting human life." And that phrasing of sacred function that Ayn Rand employs, I think Vollmann is bringing up almost ironically to emphasize the almost quasi-religious phenomena of our attachment to certain ways of creating electrical power. The ways that there's a culture that develops around oil and coal, and an attachment to what was, and an avoidance of shifting to what could be new. That avoidance of needing to change to adapt to a different world situation is precisely so much of the ideological challenge that Vollmann tries to journalistically dive into throughout the rest of the book. And it illustrates the mindset of many that Vollmann ends up interviewing throughout the book. And he has a lot of incredible interviews where he meets with people who are in charge of these businesses that are digging deeper and deeper into the ground. And the things that they're willing to admit because they sort of take it as obvious and perfectly moral, this ownership of the ground and the use of it for whatever ends are best for business. Vollmann ends up pulling out of these interviews a lot of this mindset that ends up permeating so much of what keeps us so stultified in a certain way of being. Then we start with this lengthy technical definition on Vollmann's part, where he describes the internal combustion engine and he gives a direct definition from it. And it's very scientifically rigorous, and it's an intense dissection of the technology, and it's giving us a tease of a certain aspect of what's going to be occurring throughout this book, which is going to be a lot of very technical summations of machinery alongside the more personal descriptions that he mixes in throughout. And so this technical description is suddenly interrupted with this rhetorical turn of, but what was the work for? And that is the central question that the rest of the book is trying to deal with. What are we doing all of this for? That question of, but what was the work for, ends up transforming the text from a technical description into an existential meditation of like, wait a minute, what are we doing here? He ends up suggesting with this switch of, but what is it all for, a kind of demand for philosophical inquiry into the purpose and consequence of what it is that we're attached to. Then he reminds us of the hypothetical listener who is supposed to be there throughout the whole book when he speaks of himself in the past tense and tries to make us appreciate the utter convenience of electricity merely being a fingertip movement away. When he says, when my generation was alive, I used to wake up, reach out, and turn a switch to light up my bedside. To you who can no longer live this way, this must sound as incredible as if I were to claim that I called on angels or that I could wander anywhere without a radiation meter. And that last description of a radiation meter is this stark image of potential consequences. One part of the book is his focusing in on nuclear energy as well, and some of obviously the ways that it is nearly impossible to get rid of nuclear waste once it's created. And so he talks about that element of consequence too. He really kind of looks at a bunch of different forms of energy throughout the 2 volumes of Carbon Ideologies. And so when he brings up that radiation meter, that is that hint of that kind of lamentation that he gets into. And again, that hypothetical listener is someone who doesn't get to have these conveniences anymore because via our need for convenience, we end up sacrificing their capacity for it in the future. Now, while he focuses on the convenience, he also is trying to reveal some of the fragility of that technological infrastructure when he says, and I do admit that every now and then the bulb would burn out. And so he's reminding us that, of course, we had these moments where we are suddenly struck with the realization that these things that we have around us are not guaranteed. But it is so striking precisely because it is the exception. The electricity almost always works. And it's really when it doesn't that we're suddenly remembering how relied upon these things are and how much taken for granted they are as just always going to be there. And when he says with exclamation, why shouldn't they serve us faithfully? That's that naive, childlike view that he references in the middle of the passage where we seem to personify the energy infrastructure with a mix of wonder and almost like magic, like, oh, it's just always going to appear. We don't often look at all that goes into us having those conveniences. And that's precisely what this book ends up being focused on, is him looking in at what goes into this electricity that we view in a kind of magical, childlike, naive way. Why should we have imagined that electrical power would ever decline to fulfill our whims? You see that reinforcement of that naive view. And then he gives a kind of poetic inventory of these conveniences, of these modern comforts. I certainly enjoyed showering over warm water, showering to cool down, showering before and maybe again after making love, washing my hair. And it ends up being a cascade of reminders of how deeply energy permeates personal experience, how we will use it to excess without much consideration of any notion of waste because it is just always available. He brings up also this just basic fact of the kinds of information that leads to our different decision-making regarding the energy that we use. He brings up the contractor who had installed his water heater and explained that their electricity would cost me less than gas. And it's this idea of suggesting like the micro-level decision-making that goes into supporting certain energy systems. And so it's the kind of blamelessness of, well, of course, we're going to go for the cheaper option. It's perfectly understandable why we would do that. And that sympathy permeates the rest of the book. He's always sympathizing with the choices that we're making. He's not trying to blame us for not making greater changes than we did. He kind of gets it the whole time. And he talks about his own side of him having contributed to that same kind of convenience, right? In the case of the water heater. And when he describes the hissing battery-powered gun, the great nails that flew out, slamming themselves deep into boards, when he talks about the warm nail heads that they left behind, he's transforming a simple description into a poetic exploration of technological capability. He's like making us appreciate the power and strangeness of the technology that we otherwise would take for granted. And this footnote about this realtor friend describing global warming with the word evolutionary, it kind of signals Vollmann's interest in linguistic framing, like climate change. You know, as soon as you use the phrase, oh, it's just evolutionary, suddenly that gives us permission to not make a big deal out of it. It's sort of like, okay, well, it's just going to happen, so let's not worry about it. It's evolution. It's just the natural order of things. And even though nothing has physically changed, as soon as we frame it as, oh, it's just natural, oh, it's just what always has happened, then we remove our responsibility from needing to do anything about it. Even though, of course, we have the capacity to do a great number of things, and the vast majority of our life has nothing to do with what's natural. So it's interesting, that little footnote, just that phrase evolutionary, gives the person permission to not have to care about what's happening. And then Vollmann also reveals his own psychological resistance in that end of that footnote, where he says, I began to suspect that global warming was inevitable. And that is a crucial interpretive statement on Vollmann's part, because he's positioning his work not as a call to action or some kind of scientific argument, but merely as a record of what happened. And it's this fatalistic view that he holds that he ends up being consistent about throughout this book in regards to climate change, because he views it as a documentation of a process that's already in motion. We've already committed ourselves so wholly to this particular way of being, and he doesn't have the expectation that we're going to change dramatically. It's kind of depressing when you read the two volumes, because it's really just an inundation of all the ways in which we are royally fucked, and there's not much that can be done realistically with the kind of psychology that we have. And we see reminders of this again and again just in our political choices. It's him really just kind of lamenting that fact, but also accepting that fact. He just accepts that, well, someone still needs to document how did we get here. Someone still needs to be there to record our mindset, to help the future generations understand how could you allow something like this to happen. And that ends up being so much of the project of these two volumes. And further along in this passage, he discusses the admission of collective ignorance, which is really so much of the book's central project, is trying to illuminate and remove that ignorance from us by giving us the details of each source of energy and also what goes into each of those sources of energy. But he talks about that collective ignorance when he says, neither he nor I would have known the answer in regards to had someone inquired as to whether a gas or electric heater was, quote, better for the planet. And all of these lines in this opening section establish carbon ideologies as this intimate, personal experience of energy consumption. Even though he's giving us generalized facts and statistics about how energy works and what goes into the energy that we take for granted, he's also always bringing in the personal. That's why there's so many interviews throughout this book, and he even has examples of just him eating ice cream with his now passed away daughter. And he talks about like the ease of travel and just being able to be with each other and joy in the benefits of the electricity that we always have access to. He's just making us consider the position that we're in, because it could be so easy not to think about it. And he's just trying to get us to think more and more about, wait, it is so amazing what we have, all the work that went into this, and yet there is a cost that we still have to think about and consider. Of course, he takes the fatalistic view that even though he's helping us consider it, it's already too late. And it creates a real sense of tragedy to the overarching work. It feels like a work of someone who tried to study this material and then found himself feeling deeply hopeless. And instead of just stopping, he chose to write it all down, that hopelessness. And that's what we end up with in this book. I almost discourage you from reading it if you want to read about the energy infrastructure that affects climate change, and if you want to read about it in a way that leaves you with something to hope for or something positive, because that's not Vollmann's goal. He really is merely a documentarian trying to take it all in. And in many ways, he merely wants us to see the understandable ugliness of our psychological adherence to whatever is the norm. And that is really what carbon ideologies is all about. And so you can see the strange questioning of boundaries that all of these books circle around. We have Vollmann questioning the norms that we have in our current day with carbon ideologies. He also questions the norms around the borders around nations. We have Joseph McElroy's attempt to deal with the boundaries that separate individuals. And then we have Johnson's Anniversaries that deals with the boundaries of space and memory and time. And all of this is captured in these grand maximalist works. And I hope that looking at just the opening of each of these works gave you enough of a taste so that you can know which ones you want to pursue and dedicate yourself to in your own time. And I hope you found it intriguing, just the way that these books start and how they try to bring us into that contract from writer to reader of commitment, of time, and attention to detail. I hope I helped you find some more great, big, wonderful books. I'll leave you with one more passage. This will be from Women and Men, and I hope that it better illustrates the strangeness and beauty of McElroy's prose style. The child looks up from its work, and no one knows if this is that unknown child who said, "I know what's been going on. Don't think I don't know." For we can't tell except that this child is one of us, the child doing homework. Homework that is new to us, at least if not to the angels rumored circulating in us. Whose child is this? There may be others in the next room and are, and we, of whom these children are parts as if we were the whole, note that this child who looks up at the dust-sheen gray screen of a small TV and reaches and turns it on and then off and looks down again at the math workbook studies rotation, which, if we let ourselves, we at once grasp, and with regret as odd, vague, wide, and bodily as this child's studies in rotation are to us abstract. For R equals apparently almost any number. But we are in the next room now, where another is copying homework information on those giant molehills to be seen several hundred feet apart in Persia, now Iran. Mark the well-known Quanitz, your system of underground canals that irrigate the desert by drawing moisture from the earth. And these channels under the desert go on as surely as they have been insufficiently understood these 5,000 years. How they collect water from the dry desert and return it. The unknown child has not quite yet asked why these desert canals need to be studied. The child writes on, and is part of our larger concentration taking the form we now see of dispersal, though the curve of this dispersal we don't quite nail down, but at least point to, and feel the pointing inward, don't we? To two chief specialists so far, the opera singer's Fifth Avenue physician and his Ojibwe medicine man, one-third CO in fact, between whom our concentration shifts because drawn either way. For instance, toward the Ojibwe Indian, who had guaranteed there would be at least one tapeworm in the belly of the pike tank loaded narrowly by him in its own Mullocks water to take its own high road airborne from Minnesota to New York. This guarantee was backed by his long sporting acquaintance with the diva's physician, who fished with him regularly and had arranged, through his star patient and star friend, the singer herself, who was of South American extraction, for a South American government to sponsor, along with several of its young nationals, this Native American healer in an aeronautics program at a small college within shooting distance of Lake Superior, as the diva's doctor put it. So I hope that passage demonstrates to you some of the strange movements that McElroy employs in his prose sometimes. He went from talking about a child doing homework to practically everything else by the end of that second paragraph. So thanks for watching. If you're watching at this point, you're one of the rare few, but I'll see you guys around next time. Bye-bye.